All right, wonderful. So welcome everyone to week 14, season 46, year 23 of the KGB Monday Night Poetry Series. It is our fall 2020 season finale, Brave New World edition. And we thank everyone who has opened their screens to us during this strangest of years. Though we all prefer the warmth and character of the real KGB space, I would like to point out on the bright side how miserable we would all be making each other if we were right there, currently. There are about 40 people in this Zoom room, and were we all shoehorned into there, we would be, I would probably be looking out at you from the lectern, and having the, egg with two yolks thought of what a great energy. And if there is a fire, I'm going to jump out the window. And so our opening poet tonight, Kimberly Gray, is the author of 2 books of poetry, Systems for the Future of Feeling, just out from Persea Books, and The Opposite of Light, winner of the 2015 Lexi Rudnitsky Prize. However, it is what will be Kim's 3rd book, A Mother is an Intellectual Thing, which I've had the astonishment of reading in manuscript that made me so eager to include her in this bill. A book-length text of experimental essays dealing with the speaker's abandonment by her own mother, the manuscript's language emerges from an idea for a suitable language. The solution is a counterintuitive pairing between a clinically icy typographical sentence and a powerfully emotional content. She incorporates other fields, biology, phonology, acoustics, as prose can. Discrete lyric poems are occasionally embedded in the prose, which might suggest that what the poems are embedded in isn't poetry, but the prose throughout has the sort of concision and leaping energy that we associate with poetry, as it's a prose by a writer that understands the ballistic chemistry of verse. All poems must, in their own way, drum, and A Mother is an Intellectual Thing has poetry in its blood, which is to say, a rhythm, paradoxical flow that marries the isolation of fragments and the drive of rhetorical anaphora. Anyway, when I read this manuscript, I was like, so how did you come even to begin to find your way to thinking something like this was possible? And Kimberly said, and Carson. I said, who? No, I didn't say that. I said, Carson is the North American poet who, in Thelonious Monk's lingo, is the one most like herself, which is to say, less like anyone else. She is also very different text by text. A Carsonian athlete, so to speak, could be said to be a sort of poet who rows over certain less interesting shoals towards more unusual fish, thinks outside of the proverbial spatial metaphors, does not repeat her ideas. Kimberly Gray is such a writer. She's a recipient of the Stegner Fellowship from Stanford, a Civitella Ranieri Fellowship, Research and Dissertation Fellowships from the University of Cincinnati. We welcome her here today, Kimberly Gray.
Wow, thank you so much, Matt. Wow, yeah, I'm only reading 3 poems. So I'll be done very quickly so we can get to our legends of the night. But I'm really grateful to be able to read for you. I'm actually not reading from the book Matt just so eloquently described, which is not published yet, it's just under contract now, and it will come out in a few years. Whoops, sorry. I'm going to read from 3 poems from my 2nd book, which is actually published tomorrow officially. It's Systems for the Future of Feeling. I have this really beautiful artwork from Hilma af Klint that the Hilma af Klint Foundation in Sweden gave us permission to use, and I'm really grateful for that. And yes, I actually met you, Anne, I'm sure you don't remember, but when I was a Stegner Fellow at Stanford in 2013, and you came as the more visiting writer, we met there, and I got to meet Curry as well, so. Yeah, so I'm just gonna read 3 poems. The first is called A Difficult System. Sorry. I love a man who is difficult to love, the way a horse is difficult to ride when the horse is a man. Or when you don't stroke him enough, or you do, but you stroke him wrongly and you don't love him completely. I love the difficulty of loving a man incompletely. His blue, his black, his back, I have not mounted enough. It's hard. The body is difficult, even the horse's body, its muscled frame always galloping away. Its mane, the main reason I mean is to stay, to hold on. They're hard to know the difference between. I could say that loving a man is an easy task. I could say the man and I are beautiful like two horses in the earliest blurry light. Always love is useless. Or the horse is, because you don't know how to ride it and it can't run fast enough. Or it runs too fast. And there you are standing alone in a field as it rushes past you. Let's not mistake what's difficult here. The man, the manner of loving him or leaving him or believing him that his body wants to be had easily by your body and not by any body that can be simply had. I love a man who is difficult to love the way a man is difficult to love. The way a horse that is running keeps on running, so you will hold it harder. So hold it harder. Its continuously difficult body. Then go on loving him, easily as hard. The second poem I'm going to read, because Matt was talking so much about the mother book, is what I call my third book, and you guys are talking about mother fail early when I first logged on, and I thought that was ironic, but I have a narcissistic personality disordered mother, and I'm from a very large dysfunctional family. I'm one of 8 children, and I'm a triplet, and I am estranged from almost everybody now for 6 years, for lots of reasons. And so this is called Family System. That we are eased often into and from each other means we have options, like the body easily deciding when it loves and when it unloves, an estuary of sorts. It becomes source-like, where all things run. It's so much like that. Anyone who has a body knows. Perhaps it's for geographical reasons. We go and it's rampant toward the thing that unwants us. In fact, I demonstrated it. Once in a house where nothing loved me, I loved everything back. It was astonishing. The furniture curled against backbones, and those people didn't know. Those people didn't know what to do. So together we suffered with a yellowing ease. Even the trees outside were quiet. I estimate that's all it took, a day, maybe longer, to become like an erasure. They erased me from that house, held the curtains open wider until the light unshaped my love, not shockingly, into something harder. And the last poem that I'll read, I did not write in 2020, but it feels like a poem that is apt for this really insane year that we've had. So I thought that I would finish up with this one. Thank you, everybody, for listening. It's called How We Take Our Grief. We take our grief privately and in the morning, and drink our coffee and drink our tea. We hold the newspaper out with our arms, and we hold the fork that holds the egg, that holds hunger. We put it in our mouth. We put it in our mouth. Twice the clock strikes 3, and privately we sit together. We think the orange juice is too bright. We pour it in a glass and think. We drink the brightness, and it disappears. We take the last muffin and split it into 3. Our 2 mouths hold each other. Privately, we think it's the mind that holds us. We sit striking the thought. We hold the clock that holds the mind. We think the clock is in our arms. We think the clock is our arms. Privately, the thought disappears. We pour the morning. We drink the morning together and split the brightness. We take the morning out of us and put it in our mouths. We drink it. We hold our grief out in front of us. We think this is private. We take our grief and pour it in a glass. We think we have mouths. We think we have arms to hold it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kimmy. That was radiant. Jason, do you want to take it from here?
And now, now it's my turn to introduce Thomas. Okay, so there is an ethics to the practice of history. And as a literary historian and historical novelist, Thomas Mallon is profoundly ethical. I first met Thomas Mallon at Breadloaf in the early 2000s when he was in the midst of writing the novel Fellow Travelers, which I could cheekily describe as a gay sex romp through McCarthyism, but is more accurately described as a tragic tale of how history works. Who has a thick enough skin to ride the waves of history, and who is left behind by virtue of their virtue or by virtue of their vice. One of the things to look forward to when we've all been vaccinated is the opera of Fellow Travelers, which has received rave reviews everywhere it has been performed. In Mallon's fiction, the political is rendered at a human scale, coming at the great man theory of history with an emphasis that never loses sight of how the men and women who have an outsized impact on the directions of governments, nations, and culture are people, flawed, ambitious, contradictory, and multifaceted. In Mallon's essay and journalism, he's a clear-eyed witness, refusing pieties and weighing people against their own time and their own values. Tonight, he'll be reading a passage from Yours Ever, considering the letters of World War I poet Wilfred Owen. Thomas Mallon is the author of 10 books of fiction, 3 volumes of nonfiction, and 2 books of essays. His work appears in The New Yorker, The Atlantic Monthly, The New York Times Book Review, and other publications. His honors include Guggenheim and Rockefeller Fellowships, the National Book Critics Circle Citation for Reviewing, and the Versailles Prize of the American Academy of Arts and Letters for Distinguished Prose Style. In 2012, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is Professor Emeritus of English at the George Washington University. Please welcome Thomas Mallon.
Thank you. I have no business at a poetry reading except in the audience. So I thank you for having me here tonight. I am utterly prose bound, but I thought I would pick this section from this book about letter writing on Owen because given the recent centenary of the First World War and the current pandemic, all of the calamities of the 19 teens are sort of back on our minds. This may, I don't know how ghoulish this is going to make me, but I need it to see. So anyway, on January 9, 1917, his first day ever in no man's land, Wilfred Owen received a letter from his mother. "It seems wrong," he replied, "that even your dear handwriting should come into such a Gehenna as this." If irony, as Paul Fussell demonstrates, was the chief mode of the very literary Great War, then the domestic communications sent by English mothers and sweethearts only added to it. Modern transport and the home front's proximity to the battlefield meant that letters often arrived inside a parcel with handkerchiefs that hadn't lost their crease and biscuits not yet grown stale. The psychic gulf between the two worlds would grow vast and bitter as English soldiers gave up their limbs and sanity and lives just boat train trips away from their own families. In his letters from France, Owen more than once reminds his mother that he is writing, quote, "while you are at tea." For all the speed and shortness of their journey, letters traveling back and forth across the Channel between 1914 and 1918 served all the ancient emotional functions of wartime correspondence. Owen's own dispatches alternate between grim frankness and filial reassurance, and on a couple of occasions he communicates his unit's position in a code arranged between him and his mother. Without the replies he receives from her, he declares he should simply give in. He cannot write her, quote, without intensity, or without sometimes falling into a woozy biblical cadence, and on other occasions he dispatches blandishments that seem more as sweethearts than as sons, dismissing all the competing charms that can be matched by the, quote, little finger of his precious mother. He knows they both, quote, find letter writing a fitter mode of intimate communication than speaking, and he would like the pages he sends to substitute for something else as well. Quote, because they are my only diary, I humbly desire you to keep these letters. This gentle son of a Shrewsbury railroad superintendent, a boy drawn to botany, evangelical religion, and above all Keats, was never a natural soldier. His 1915 enlistment in the Artist Rifles was a plunge, that very Virginia Woolf word. His first week of training marked by unexpected difficulties. Quote, we had to practice salutes on trees this very morning. You would be surprised how long it takes to do the thing properly. His early wartime letters to Susan Owen, full of good-willed self-mockery and jaunty exclamation points, chronicle a year of toughening that he swears has turned him into, quote, a different being from the lounger on divans, the reader of verse, the midday riser that he used to be. But a touching haplessness remains evident to all latter-day readers who must proceed through the correspondence with a terrible foreknowledge. The poet's delicate nerves get scraped by a bullying sergeant major, quote, amusing enough in Punch, but not when viewed from the ranks. When he has to do a bit of officering himself, Owen feels distinctly uncomfortable. I am commanding numbers of wounded men, now restored, he writes, from Milford Camp in Surrey on July 3, 1916. It gives me a great deal of pain to speak severely to them, as now and again need is. His first reports from the line show a mind and style suddenly stripped raw. The stark paragraphing of a letter written after a week spent holding a dugout near Beaumont-Hamel already resembles those verses, shorn of Edwardian fat, now being produced by the war poets. This is actually a letter, not a poem. I can see no excuse for deceiving you about these last 4 days, paragraph. I have suffered seventh hell, paragraph. I have not been at the front, paragraph. I have been in front of it. With its covering of snow, no man's land, quote, is like the face of the moon, chaotic, crater-ridden, uninhabitable, awful, the abode of madness. On January 19, 1917, Owen's company is in a ruined village, all huddled together, his mind wandering back home to Shrewsbury. 2 weeks later, he reflects with an amazement too exhausted to complete the sentence, I used to consider Tankerville Street ugly, but now, ... In April, he will be harrowed by extended duty in the line at Savy Wood. Quote, for 12 days we lay in holes, where at any moment a shell might put us out. I think the worst incident was one wet night when we lay up against a railway embankment. A big shell lit on the top of the bank, just 2 yards from my head. Before I awoke, I was blown in the air right away from the bank. I passed most of the following days in a railway cutting in a hole just big enough to lie in and covered with corrugated iron. My brother officer of B Company, 2nd Lieutenant Gaukroger, lay opposite in a similar hole, but he was covered with earth, and no relief will ever relieve him. Even this has been sanitized for his mother. He admits to Susan Owen that a doctor is nervous about my nerves, but asks that she, not for a moment, suppose I have had a breakdown. 2 days later, still at the casualty clearing station, he concedes, as casually as he can manage, some of us have been sent down here as a little mad. Possibly I am one of them. He has in fact been shell-shocked, and only 4 days later in a letter to his sister does he reveal the grotesque truth of what did him in. Quote, you know, it was not the Boche that worked me up, nor the explosives, but it was living so long by poor old Cock Robin, as we used to call 2nd Lieutenant Gaukroger, who lay not only nearby, but in various places, around and about, if you understand. I hope you don't. Suffering nightmares, Owen is invalided to Craiglockhart War Hospital in Scotland, where after mustering the courage to approach, he has his famous encounters with Siegfried Sassoon, the handsome huntsman turned poet, a half dozen years older and newly famous for his flamboyant protest against the war. Quote, Shakespeare reads vapid after the poems of Sassoon, Owen insists to his mother, pronouncing himself unworthy even to light his pipe. The older poet offers some military-sounding literary advice. The last thing he said was, sweat your guts out writing poetry. Eh, said I, sweat your guts out, I say. He also warned me against early publishing. After 2 months of this mentoring, Sassoon leaves the hospital, prompting from Owen a sort of love letter, filled with hero worship but also self-protection. Know that since mid-September, when you still regarded me as a tiresome little knocker on your door, I held you as Keats plus Christ plus Elijah plus my colonel plus my father confessor plus Amenophis IV in profile. I love you, dispassionately, so much, so very much, that the blasting little smile you wear on reading this can't hurt me in the least. Still, he urges Sassoon to confide this letter to the fire. 2 years earlier, when enlistment in the Artists' Rifles took him to London, Owen had excitedly noted how close he was to the informal headquarters of the new Georgian poetry movement. The poetry bookshop is about 7 minutes' walk, he told his mother. There's a reading this very night. During his later convalescence, the connection to Sassoon and his own scattered publications exposed him to some first flickers of the limelight. He meets H.G. Wells and Arnold Bennett at the Reform Club and attends Robert Graves' wedding. His poems begin to move beyond the timid realm of discipleship and acquire a more authentic style. But if they become less self-consciously Keatsian, Owen himself remains a steadfast practitioner of the Romantic poet's advice for living. He knows Keats's prescriptions from the earlier poet's letters, which he quotes and rereads and tries to keep on hand. Please include in parcel, he writes his father from one training camp, Keats's letters, volume 4 and 5. When Owen talks of how he turns into, quote, whatever and whoever I see while going down to Edinburgh on the tram, greengrocer, policeman, shopping lady, errand boy, paper boy, blind man, crippled Tommy, bank clerk, carter, all of these in half an hour. A reader recognizes Keats's negative capability, the chameleon-like empathy that led him into poetry. The Owen who declares excitement to be always necessary to my happiness, and who announces, I hate old age, realizes that there is only one way we avoid the latter, in some violent variant of Keats's early death. I go out of this year a poet, my dear mother, he writes on New Year's Eve 1917, after a year of transformation almost comparable to Keats's living year of 1819. Tennyson, whose music will remain detectable in even Owen's most unsparing war poems, now seems a great child to this 24-year-old successor. So should I have been, he declares, but for Beaumont-Hamel, a place he remembers as cobbled with skulls. Graves counsels Owen to outlive this war because he's one of those who will revolutionize English poetry once it's over. Owen can now even declare to see beyond Sassoon, whose poetry has lately, quote, become a mere vehicle of propaganda. For all his poignant careerism, Owen won't let himself overvalue publishing success, since his own subjects, the men fighting the war, regard print as, quote, a dead letter. Their handwritten personal letters, which they compose all day, and which Owen is called upon to censor by the hundred, are another matter. He sees the hope of peace expressed in each, quote, the daddies are especially touching, and the number of XXXs to sisters and mothers weigh more in heaven than Victoria Crosses. Owen's own letters show him becoming less evangelical and more Christian, as he begins perceiving a pacifist light, quote, which never will filter into the dogma of any national church. The nice young man grows less afraid of political blasphemy, too. While training in January 1916, long before arriving in France, he had reported home about one colonel's, quote, brilliant lecture on the causes of the war. By June of the following year, he lists his personal war aim as, quote, the extinction of militarism, beginning with the Prussian kind, and tells of observing a major refuse to get on a train with the explanation, I absolutely decline to travel in a coach where there are men. And by March 1918, with only months to live, Owen will characterize a boy who has just left school as, quote, a creature of killable age. He often imagines a life for himself after the war as a flyer or an antiques dealer, perhaps in the bungalow for which he draws up a design, but he resists exempting himself from the slaughter. At the casualty clearing station in March 1917, shortly before being sent to Craig Lockhart, he decides he would be, quote, better able to do service in a hospital than in the trenches, but I suppose we all think that. As 1917 ends, he knows he will have to go back to the front if he wants to describe the faces of the doomed, quote, more terrible than terror. He begins forcing himself to have the explicit battle nightmares from which he's supposed to be convalescing. I do so because I have my duty to perform towards war. The dates on the letters begin to click past in an awful countdown. A reader feels himself trying to thwart what's coming. Still in England in May of 1918, Owen glimpses a chance of staying there as a lecturer to a cadet battalion, thanks to a friend in the War Office. Sassoon even threatens to stab his protege in the leg if he attempts returning to France. But as Owen writes his sister in truthful self-ridicule, I take myself solemnly now. By September, he is back in the line, bearing a different sort of evangelical witness. Early in October, he receives the Military Cross for action described in a citation. Quote, on the company commander becoming a casualty, he assumed command and showed fine leadership and resisted a heavy counterattack. He personally captured an enemy machine gun in an isolated position and took a number of prisoners, unquote. He tells his mother, everything reads like prefiguration now, that he, quote, fought like an angel. His nerves, he further informs her, are this time in perfect order. He tells the same to Sassoon, but elaborates to his fellow soldier poet on the reason for his calm. His senses have been charred into numbness. Dealing with the company's mail, quote, I now don't take the cigarette out of my mouth when I write deceased over their letters. He composes his own last words home at 6:15 p.m., October 31, 1918, preserving with eerie immediacy the conditions in which he writes them. Quote, so thick is the smoke in this cellar that I can hardly see by a candle 12 inches away, and so thick are the inmates that I can hardly write for pokes, nudges, and jolts. The armistice was signed on November 11, the week Susan Owen received a telegram announcing that her son had been killed a week earlier. The power of his letters is such that one almost forgets it was their enclosures, the poems he sent with them, that made Wilfred Owen the Great War's one truly imperishable writer. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Okay, we have obviously one reader left. I was wondering if anybody wanted to take a second to go to the bathroom or anything. That's what we would do at the bar. I don't know. How are we feeling?
I think we're good. Let's power
We're
through.
good? All right, let's just move on. Okay, wonderful. Very excited for our next reader. Anne Carson belongs on the short list of the world's great writers. No writer I can think of has coiled the double helix of the personal and the universal so perfectly or profoundly. Her ability to merge has been so perfected that she's constantly arriving at new frontiers in poetry, never limiting her work to the distinction of any one genre. Knox, for example, is an art object, just one example, so concentrated and fully conceived that it's easy to forget how much it accomplishes at once. It's largely, it's an elegy for her brother, and it's so moving on all its fronts that I actually made a point of buying a copy for my own brother, who is a linguist, because it seems to express in a way that is sometimes difficult with your own speech what losing him would feel like for me. Simply seeing it stand out on your bookshelf gives a kind of tranquility or a sense that suffering is known or that you are known. Anne Carson is a trailblazer. Over and over again, she's opened doors we'd perceived as walls. The scholarly essay at the end of Glass, Irony, and God shocked many of us into rethinking our ideas of genre. The light snark and self-pity of the characters in her translations of Euripides transformed how many of us saw those stately works. Autobiography of Red essentially redefined the novel in verse for a new generation, and these examples only begin to scratch the surface. Another artist can make an entire career on something Carson might mention in passing, as they say. Yet there's a seamlessness to it that leads to a frank and uncompromising assessment of the human condition, the ways we are made to suffer, compelled to make others suffer, and called to persist with love. Anne Carson is the author of 11 books of poetry, many translations, and other texts. Her awards and honors include the Landon Literary Award, the Pushcart Prize, the Griffin Poetry Prize, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and the MacArthur Fellowship. She currently teaches in New York University's creative writing program. If we were in the bar, we would ask you to welcome Anne Carson with a standing ovation, but as you are on Zoom, please stay seated as you welcome Anne Carson.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yes?
Yes.
I want to thank Kimberly and Thomas for inviting me to read with you, and KGB people for arranging it all. And thank you, John, for the overwhelming introduction. I was thinking I should read something from the year that I started to write, in the year when Thomas and I were in the 92nd Street Y on the 8th floor, and he was doing nothing and I was working very hard every day. So these are pieces from that time, so they're old, but I think they sort of still are okay. It's all from a book called Short Talks, which was published in 92. It begins with an introduction. Short Talks, introduction. Early one morning, words were missing. Before that, words were not. In a good story, Aristotle tells us everything that happens is pushed by something else. One day, someone noticed that there were stars, but no words. Why? I've asked a lot of people. I think it's a good question. I began to copy out everything that was said. The marks construct an instant of nature gradually, without the boredom of a story. I emphasize this, I will do anything to avoid boredom. It is the task of a lifetime. You can never know enough, never work enough, never use the infinitives and participles oddly enough, never impede the movement harshly enough, never leave the mind quickly enough. Short talk on Homo sapiens. With small cuts, Cro-Magnon man recorded the moon's phases on the handles of his tools, thinking about her as he worked. Animals, horizon, face in a pan of water. In every story I tell comes a point where I can see no further. I hate that point. It is why they call storytellers blind. It is a taunt. Short talk on Gertrude Stein about 9:30 p.m. How curious, I had no idea today has ended. Short talk on Ovid. I see him there on a night like this, but cool, the moon blowing through black streets. He has supper and walks back to his room. The radio is on the floor. Its luminous green dial blares softly. He sits down at the table. People in exile write so many letters. Now Ovid is weeping. Each night about this time, he puts on sadness like a garment and goes on writing. In his spare time, he is teaching himself the local language, Getic, in order to compose in it an epic poem that no one will ever read. Short talk on major and minor. Major things are wind, evil, a good fighting horse, prepositions, inexhaustible love, the way people choose their king. Minor things include dirt, the names of schools of philosophy, mood and not having a mood, the correct time. There are more major things than minor things overall, yet there are more minor things than I have written here, but it is disheartening to risk them. When I think of you, hearing this, I do not want you to be taken captive, separated by a wire mesh lined with glass from your life itself, like some Electra. Short talk on the total collection. From childhood, he dreamed of being able to keep with him all the objects in the world lined up on his shelves and bookcases. He denied lack, oblivion, or even the likelihood of a missing piece. Order streamed from Noah in blue triangles, and as the pure fury of his classifications rose around him, engulfing his life, they came to be called waves by others who drowned a world of them. Short talk on walking backwards. My mother forbade us to walk backwards. That is how the dead walk, she would say. Where did she get this idea? Perhaps from a bad translation. The dead, after all, do not walk backwards, but they do walk behind us. They have no lungs and cannot call out, but would love for us to turn around. They are victims of love, many of them. Short talk on pink. I was fond of the angels. Having them about the house added a gravitas to our occasions and a lot of light. The purest, most luminous light blew around them wherever they were. Anyway, the one of them gave no trouble, usually lounging quiet in his corner of the fresco, practicing gallant gestures, a bit of a dreamer, I always thought. I nodded to him whenever I went up the stairs. It was the other one who showed temperament, stalking the salons, trailing folds of bloody cloud or sunset, making a show of his wings, as if they were bigger or grander than other wings, as if they were too grand for our house. It vexed my father. Oh, it vexed him. The sound of wings fanning and closing downstairs made him grind his teeth. Flecks of gold feather appeared in our soup. Father was not a patient man. Still, I was shocked to hear savage cries from the basement one day and went down to look. I have to admit, I had not actually realized, I hadn't done science at school, that you could melt angels down by application of heat and spiritual pressure, not to mention the color. Why pink? Had one of them been having Tiepolo dreams when Father turned up the furnace? I had nothing to say, my emotions all over the place. I watched the whole process. And the saddest part, but no, it wasn't sadness, so much as a dim, wild, rudimentary longing for something I cannot name. As the angels melted, they seemed to devolve down the ages. At first heavenly beings, then prehistoric birds, then regular seagulls, then bipedal humans just walking away, then glass. They just walked away into glass. Why does everybody look so much more lonely from the back? And now, in closing, and in defiance of the logic of Zoom and of all the regulations of COVID performance, we're going to do an interactive short talk in which I say a part, you say a part, it comes together to form a tiny Zoom meaning.
I should say here, everyone has the power to unmute themselves.
Yeah, you could unmute yourself and it will be more fun.
So everyone, I don't have to unmute you. You actually can unmute yourself. So everyone should unmute yourself now.
Yes, and
so that we
please
can
do
make
so
this
that
work.
it's not just me and Jason. There you
So you, in this first one, your line is simply the word deciduous with a question mark at the end. So deciduous. Shall we practice? 1, 2, 3.
Deciduous?
Oh, fantastic. Remember your line. Talk on reading. Some fathers hate to read but love to take the family trips. Some children hate trips but love to read. Funny how often they find themselves passengers in the same automobile. I glimpsed the stupendous, clear-cut shoulders of the Rockies from between paragraphs of Madame Bovary. Cloud shadows roved languidly across her huge rock throat, traced her fur flanks. And since those days, I do not look at hair on female flesh without thinking,
Deciduous?
hey, see how that works, okay? Okay, one more. In this one, your line is, let's buy it, what a bargain. So it's two sentences run together with an exclamation mark at the end. Let's practice.
Let's
buy it.
What a bargain.
Try to keep together.
go.
Your talk on the sensation of airplane takeoff. Well, you know, that could be true love running towards my life with its arms up yelling.
Let's buy it.
What a bargain.
Bargain.
Thank you and good night.
Awesome.
So this is our season finale. We will give everyone a break and we'll come back on January 11th with Don Lundy Martin and Carl Phillips. And we'll be back to our usual 7 o'clock time.
If anybody is not on our email blast list, you can type your email address in the chat and I will add you. And you can come have some fun with us again.
Mhm.
Oh, and one more announcement. The winner of last week's open mic was Shandy Walton. So congratulations to Shandy Walton,
Shandy.
who came to us from Italy.
Wow.
Yeah.
And any updates you might want to see about anything revolving around KGB bar is probably going to be on Instagram and Facebook. Matt does the Facebook, I do the Instagram, and I can put the Instagram handle in the chat as well.
Awesome.
Fantastic.